There we go. So this is being recorded, and we will be posting this on the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's YouTube page, the Foundation's YouTube page. And I will be sending everybody an email with that link as soon as Ken Ross has some time to do that and transform this talk into something we can look at on YouTube. I'm very excited this morning to welcome Cheryl Jones, who has been part of my life. We were just talking about this, we think over 30 years at this point. And so we're very happy to have Cheryl with us. She's just posted her contact information, which will also be included with the email when I send the link out later in the day. I'm going to begin by introducing the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. For those of you that may not be familiar with the foundation, we welcome you. If anybody wants to put up in the chat where it is they're zooming in from, that's wonderful, and there will be an opportunity for questions. If people have questions and you want to post them in the chat as Cheryl is speaking, please feel free to do that. It's helpful if you preface it with question, so I can easily find those questions, and there will be time for people to raise their hand in the Zoom way by using the reaction icon down at the bottom or top of your page and clicking on the raised hand icon so you could actually speak with Cheryl yourself. So as we begin, the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization that was inspired by the life of psychiatrist, humanitarian, and hospice pioneer Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. The foundation was begun 1 year after Elisabeth's death by her son, Ken Ross. And over the course of the last 15 or 16 years now, the foundation chapters have been created on 4 continents that continue her mission to develop hospice, palliative care, and grief support. In 2019, almost all of Elisabeth's archives were donated to Stanford University, which is in the process of creating a digital library to make her papers available to the public. And for for all of those words, I also just want to say that what Elisabeth, Elisabeth's belief, her really strongly held value was that unconditional love is healing, and by extending that to people that we care for, it can be a transformative experience, both for people who are having an end-of-life experience, for those that are supporting them, and for those that are grieving losses. So in that spirit, I can't think of a better person to have with us today than Cheryl. And a brief introduction to Cheryl. She's a grief counselor, and during her education as a marriage and family therapist, her first wife was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which at the time was uniformly a terminal illness with a 6-month to 1-year prognosis. Joanne, defying all odds, lived another 8 years, and Cheryl engaged in preparing for her death on a daily basis. And this is the time that I met Joanne and Cheryl. She received training during this period from Stephen and Andrea Levine and Richard Onley. And after her wife's death, Cheryl immersed herself in her own grief, surprised by the frequent moments of joy. She is also a group leader at the free therapy program of the Women's Cancer Resource Center. She's trained with many, many folks, and she is also now the host of Good Grief, which is a wonderful resource and radio program. It's on the internet. She was also the clinical director at the Alternative Family Project, which served the therapeutic needs of LGBTQ families in San Francisco. She's also an author of a beautiful book that I will let you tell. I'll let you tell about, Cheryl. I'm going to bring you down here now. I think that those introductions are always wonderful, but I would love Cheryl to just say a couple of words about herself. And we met actually at a Stephen Levine workshop in 1988, I believe. It might have been in the fall. And that happened because Stephen had just told me I should practice standing meditation, which I did with a lot of zest, and immediately passed out in the room of 300 people, which brought everybody's attention to me, including Joanne and Cheryl's. And I met them shortly after that experience. As Cheryl reminded me, there were very few Black women in that room or Black people in that room, and Joanne was one of the maybe only people. And from that time, we became fast friends. And so, Cheryl, thank you so much for coming this morning and talking about grief, something you have spent a lifetime navigating. So thank you.
I'm so happy to be here and to remember. It was great before we came on to remember, all of a sudden in the middle of this meditation, whap, Susan fell to the floor. And it was a real meditation because we're here to talk about things that happen that are not predicted and come out of the blue, such as COVID. So I think it's a great thing to remember. It makes me happy to see how many different places people are from. And maybe that's a slight, I'm always looking for the good news that comes out of the bad news. And, this global community that has become so viscerally present during these last couple of years, I do appreciate that we can be together like this. So Susan told you a lot of the things I've done, but I think that I also want to say that I always do what I experience. When I wanted to have a kid as a lesbian, I started doing groups for lesbians considering kids. Everything that happens in my life, I make something out of, and I think that's part of my general personality, which I'm grateful for because it means I learn from my experiences. So I want to start with a poem. Susan mentioned that we met through Stephen Levine, and I find that many of my teachers have the poetic in them. It really appeals. They either have poetry or music. I guess I love words. So I'd like to start with a David Whyte poem called The Well of Grief. Those who will not slip beneath the still surface on the well of grief, turning down through its black water to the place we cannot breathe, will never know the source from which we drink, the secret water cold and clear, nor find in the darkness glimmering the small round coins thrown by those who wished for something else. The reason I chose that poem today is that for the last few years, we've been drowning in a sea or swimming, or maybe we've even found boats in a sea of global grief. It's been where I am 2 years that I've basically been in my house, except for when I'm walking the dog. And a few other exceptions, but overwhelmingly, I've been in my home, and many people have been. And even people who haven't been are also experiencing this COVID time in whatever way they are. And so I've thought a lot about what resilience means in a time like this. And that leads me to what resilience means, period. I did what lots of people that are going to speak do and re-looked up resiliency. I've looked that up many times. But there were two definitions. The first, the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, ... toughness. And the second, the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. I really don't like either of those definitions. I think what I consider resilience is the ability to change shape in response to an experience. So it's not even just like a willow where we can bend, but it is quite literally about learning and growing and redeeming our tough experiences. And I guess at the very beginning, I was noticing that I was able to kind of move through the feelings I was having about what was going on more quickly than some people. And I realized that I had learned that living next to death for almost a decade, that somehow during that time, I had come to know how to navigate. And of course, now in these last 8+ years, I've interviewed probably 400 people who've had the experience of deep and profound loss and come through it to a different life, come through it to a place of growth that they appreciate. I do want to be clear, that does not take away what's painful. We can still have moments. I can still have moments. For instance, if I'm walking behind someone on the street and they look from the back like Joanne, and they have her walk or their legs are the same shape, I can still experience a drop inside of my body. The difference, though, between me before her illness and her death and my grief and now is that I am not disturbed by that. In fact, there's a way in which I'm grateful for it because I loved her. She died. It affects me. So I don't argue with it. And I think that's a primary skill of resilience in my definition of it, is that we can grow and change in relationship to our difficult experiences, and that nothing is, I feel a great debt to Stephen Levine, because I feel with him I learned, don't reject anything. It's all part of it. And learning to be with that, not easy, because I don't think we're trained that way. I think we're trained to see our feelings and our experiences as a problem if they're negative, that we should get rid of. And that doesn't work too well if what we're going through, we can't change. It's in our response that our power is. So I want to talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth to start out with, as a backdrop to some ways I have of thinking about cultivating resilience in ourselves and in each other. Probably some of you, many of you know about this idea of post-traumatic growth. I didn't know it was being studied for a long time, but when I heard the term, I knew it was what I was working with my clients. Post-traumatic growth is the idea that in response to trauma, and of course, any kind of grief, any kind of loss is a trauma, either small t or big T, 60 to 90% of people who face trauma will say after time goes by that they grew as a result. About 7% would get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that would be a persistent traumatic reaction to what happened. What is it that changed? What are the areas in which people grow? These were all very familiar when I went and looked it up. The way we relate to others, a sense of new possibilities, awareness of our personal strength, a change in our spiritual outlook, either deepening or changing entirely, and a greater appreciation for life. I'm pretty sure if you're in this room that many of you could identify with some of those, or maybe many of those, because something has made you open to coming to a talk on grief and resilience. So I have to think you've had challenges that have led you to consider what you make of your challenges, where you go from there. I have to say that I've probably witnessed post-traumatic growth on some level with nearly every person I've ever counseled. And I can't separate myself as a therapist from myself as a person who believes in growth after loss, since the two, as Susan mentioned, coincided. I was training as a therapist while I was in a loss experience. And so I've always seen loss as a lens through which people's problems show themselves. There's always a loss involved, and we're always trying to figure out where to go from there. I've read a lot of articles about resilience the past few years. There have been many articles, which of course is good news that we're even talking about challenges and loss and how to navigate it. When I first got to know Stephen and Susan and Andrea, his wife, and that whole community, it was much less common to see articles in the Times and to have grief talked about in kind of an open way. That has actually improved. But of course, COVID has clicked up the volume. The level of grief and loss in the background of our lives, if not the foreground, is monumental. I feel it every day, the number of deaths and other kinds of losses that have happened in this time. So most of the articles I've read, though, they really focus on what I would call self-care. Exercising enough, sleeping enough, meditating enough, not working too much. There might be some reference to making sure we talk to friends, but a lot of what I read is really about self-care. And I have to say, I learned a lot about self-care taking care of someone else, because in that long period of time, we had kids. She was quite ill. She was quite disabled the entire time. She was never out of the woods. She was never in remission. And what I learned over that almost a decade is that if I didn't take care of myself, something would happen and things would fall apart. Here's an example. I once lifted her wheelchair into the trunk of the car when I had a backache. And I knew I was feeling a little fragile. Well, can you guess what happened? I was pushed over the edge. I had to go to bed for 2 weeks, and I couldn't take care of anyone in any way. So those kinds of experiences taught me viscerally this thing about putting my own gas mask on. And that's what self-care is about, you know. How do I care for myself so that I can even think about being resilient? I got so much better at it, which I find counterintuitive, but absolutely true, that I learned how to care for myself in those physical ways. But when the 2016 US election took place, it kind of walloped me. And I thought, okay, how am I going to take care of my emotional experiences during this time? I was pretty sure I was going to have them. Gosh, not to mention, you know, then COVID hit. And I realized there were some things I had learned in the time of dealing with Joanne's illness, her death, my grief. It came down to 4 points of focus that I had become better and better at attending to. And that's what I really want to primarily focus on today, now that we've laid the background of, you know, the possibility of growing through challenge and the power of self-care. I really want to focus on how we think about developing skills of resilience, according to my definition. So I'll just tell you the 4 I came up with. I'm very open. If you find something you can't fit into one of these categories, please email me and let me know, because I haven't come up with anything yet. So and also as a backdrop, these. For me, grief has never gone in order. For many people, grief doesn't go in order. Neither do these. They're just sort of interlocking circles in an overall picture of how we go forward after challenge. Someone in the chat just asked me to repeat the definition of resilience that I have. So I'm going to do that because I do think it's an important backdrop. The ability to change shape in response to an experience, being supple, being flexible, learning. That's how I define it. So these 4 categories: grieve, feel the feelings. That is perhaps the one that for me was essential before I could really inhabit the others completely. The second, find comfort and solace. Third, find inspiration. And fourth, take action. So, as I said, no particular order to those 4 things for me, but I think learning to have our feelings, learning to accept what we're actually experiencing, both in our bodies and in our minds. It's hard to do the other ones successfully without that. And so that's my starting point. I was noticing at the beginning of COVID that even people who were very good at changing in response to things usually changed circumstance. They left a relationship. These are the people who hadn't had losses they couldn't possibly get out of, like somebody died. But even those people, were pretty focused on changing circumstance. And that didn't work because we were stuck. And not only stuck, but the people I was speaking with had not experienced a loss from COVID. Nobody had died. And they were disenfranchising their loss. They were saying, well, I don't know why I'm feeling bad because no one I know died. Everyone's healthy, everyone's fine. Not realizing that, of course, everyone I knew lost the life that they had on March 15th. In the Bay Area, we went on lockdown March 16th. So on March 15th, we had a particular life. The next day, we didn't. And the inability to make room for the feelings was leading to things like being unfocused, being anxious, crying out of the blue, being irritable, not being able to remember things, getting angrier than usual, feeling numb, having feelings you're not used to. Underneath all of that, there was this kind of, why am I feeling bad? And so a lot of the work I was doing at the beginning with people was normalizing the fact that they felt bad, asking them not to compare, asking them not to judge, to just if I ask, what's the emotion, then what would they say? And the other thing I noticed was that I had developed sort of a shorthand for that myself, which was feel something in my body and put a word to it. So sad, depressed, anxious, whatever it was, just one word. And I found that my feelings were moving through pretty quickly. Not every moment, of course, especially I made actual time to feel bad. I think that that's very worthwhile. But I did learn from Stephen that if a feeling comes in and you have it, it usually changes. So that I was seeing evidence of that. It's when we don't want to have the feeling that they tend to linger. There are so many different ways to say yes to your feelings. There's just breathing into it. There's putting a name to it. There's imagining a mouth where you're feeling it and breathing there. There's finding lists of different emotions and seeing which one fits. A little parentheses there. I don't want to leave out joy, because people were having a hard time accepting that they might feel joyful also, as if we should feel guilty for moments of joy. I'll tell you a personal experience that brought a lot of joy for me in the beginning of COVID, which was that my youngest daughter, who basically hadn't spent much time at home, probably since she was a junior in high school. She was a very driven person, still is, and did all kinds of things outside the house. She decided to come quarantine with us. Well, that was actually very joyful. We were all happy to be together. I have a feeling that she was chosen to look after us because all our kids were very concerned about us, being in the older age groups. But if I had thrown out that joy, it would have been very unbalanced. If I had felt guilty that I had any happy feelings, I spent a lot more time on my yard. I was so grateful for my yard. We have to let it all in. And I just want to say a word about mindfulness, because there's so much belief that mindfulness helps. And in this sense, the way in which I think it does help is if it's used as a way to be with what's going on. I've certainly met a lot of people who tried to use any kind of meditation as a way out of their feelings, but I value it more as a way to be with feelings. So again, I'll bet everyone in this room we have together has ways you've learned to be with feelings that work for you. And I just think it's a bottom line necessity. Things really go wrong if we can't honestly have the feelings we have. So on to the next circle, finding solace and comfort. As a friend of mine calls it, places to lament. And I love that word, lamentation, beating of the chest. I think we need that in this world. I think we have to find people who can hold space for us, be there without trying to change anything. Otherwise, lamentation won't feel safe. We'll imagine that the other person or people think we should be able to change the situation. So in that sense, lots of talk about empathy. For me, it's more than caring. It's being willing to join another person's pain without the need to end it. So finding solace and comfort, just hugely important in navigating these experiences. I had a woman in my cancer support group once who, everyone would talk about how their friends were failing them in cancer. I think there were 12 people in the group. Every single person was having that experience. And she said she wasn't having that experience. And I was really curious about that. Nobody's failing you? So I asked her, what do you think led to that, to that being true? And she said, well, 2 years before I was diagnosed with cancer, my mother died, and everyone who couldn't come through for me, I eliminated. So I think it's a universal need to be heard by people who will just hear us. And someone's asking for a repeat on my definition of empathy. Empathy, more than caring, it's being willing to join another's pain without the need to end it. I hope that helps. It's worth repeating. So I appreciate that people are commenting on that. And you can see in the story of that group member that she had actually had to vet her listeners. because there's so much in cancer, as I well know, that can't be changed. There's so much in COVID that can't be changed. Frances Weller, the author of a beautiful book, I'm going to put it right up here, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Frances Weller, great book, I love it, says that without being able to be solitary, we can't navigate our losses, our griefs, but also without community, we can't. Without community, we can't. We need both. And community in the sense of just being there with us in tough times. And of course, COVID has made this more difficult. I'm so appreciative of spaces like this, because here we are together in community. Even though we're not interacting, we're together, and we need each other to get through things like this. We need commiseration, lamentation, being heard, getting to talk about what's hard with someone who believes you'll find your way through it, holding space, as one of the authors I interviewed on my show wrote a book called Holding Space. It's entirely about how we prepare ourselves to just be present for someone. And I'll bet if you ask yourself what's given you solace in the last couple of years, it involves other people. There are ways we can comfort ourselves, but there's also ways we need to comfort each other. So let me just say, most of us aren't that good at this. One of my other favorite books is There Is No Good Card for This. It's Kelsey Crowe, and we'll send these out, and Emily McDowell. There's a page in the book called What Kind of Non-Listener Are You? And I'm going to read all the kinds of non-listeners, see which ones you identify with, because at the bottom of the page, they say, we fit in these categories. The authors say, we fit in these categories, and they name their categories, but see where you fit. The sage and therapists are so prone to this, which is welcome in therapy, but not at home. The sage gives wise perspective and advice when it wasn't asked for. The optimist always offers a bright-sided perspective, often beginning with the phrase, at least. That should be banned from grief support. At least it wasn't that bad. The doomsayer reacts with alarm to any situation, bringing up other alarming situations. The epidemiologist asks a lot of clarifying fact-based questions before learning how someone is feeling. And the all about me in an effort to relate makes the conversation all about his or her problems or situation. I would say I've got quite a bit of the sage and sometimes have to guard against the optimist just because I am an optimistic person. All that being said, I think we have to cue each other for what we want from the other person. And there's some phrases that have, over time, I've learned to suggest that people try when someone isn't listening quite well. The one I like the best is, can I vent for 5 minutes? If you come to someone and say, I just need to vent, can I vent for 5 minutes? Most people are cued that there's nothing expected of them. And people like to be useful and helpful. If you don't say something like that, often they will try to solve the problem. And that actually is different from listening. Listening is a skill that many of us have to work to develop. Another cue is, I'll cheer up later, but I'd love to just complain for a while. Anything that tells the person all you want is a listening ear. And that goes against training, as I said. So we often have to be active about what we suggest. I've noticed people have used social media a lot as an outlet for our feelings. which has pluses and minuses. The plus is that if you don't want to read the comments right away, if you just want to say, this is really, really hard, you can, and no one's going to, maybe a good friend would call you on the phone, but then you can answer or not. And I think there are moments where we don't want to take the chance on getting the wrong response. We're too vulnerable. Especially in very, very deep grief, we're often too vulnerable to hear the comments like, they're in a better place, at least you have other children, whatever it is that doesn't fit with the pain we're having. So because we need each other, I do think we need ways to differentiate when do we need solace and comfort and when do we just need to have our feelings. But then there's also the aspect of how we get proper listening and how we give proper listening. That's a match set, isn't it? I know the friendships that are the deepest for me are the ones where I know I can just be where I'm at. I'll solve the problems eventually, but I need spaces I can just be where I'm at. And I think we all do. All right, so the third circle in my ring is to find inspiration. And this one came a little bit as a surprise to me when it popped out that 2016 day when I tried to come up with what I needed. But then it didn't surprise me after I thought about it, because I had been practicing that for some time. For instance, I'd had a 2-year experiment and these experiments come to me kind of strangely, like out of the blue. But then there's a certain feeling when something is worth trying. And so I'll experiment with it. So this had been way before this time. I had decided what I wanted to do was read the newspaper. At the time, I got a paper newspaper. And I decided that what I wanted to do was leaf through the paper in the morning and not read any of the stories until I found a story that I found inspiring. And for me, most of those stories, just like all my guests later in my life, were people who'd had a terrible thing happen, and then they had gone on to make something of it. So it might be two mothers who lost their husbands at 9/11 and went on to start a foundation where they did bike trips to raise money. Every guest on my show has a story. They wrote a book, they wrote a play, they became a therapist, whatever it might be. Something came out of the hard time. I find those stories deeply inspiring and reaffirming, because the fact that we're human beings and we can, in fact, make something out of our crises. One of my sayings I like, I don't know if I heard it or made it up, is I never want to waste a good crisis. I like to take advantage of the things that happen in life because they happen. And once you've had something cataclysmic happen, you can never imagine they don't happen. They could happen anytime. So this sense of finding inspiration that we are perfectly capable of facing crisis and then having something happen afterwards, that is deeply comforting to me in my life. So the newspaper stories was one way I did that. I think that my radio show 100% started as a way to give back, but also to inspire myself. Those conversations I have every week keep me focused on what we can make of our terrible times. And it doesn't take away the terrible. One thing I like about the post-traumatic growth people is they say it's two parallel paths. You can still be traumatized and grow at the same time. I think that's very important because so many of my clients will say, you know, I haven't made any progress because they have grief feelings. But I think this idea of inspiration, we can inspire ourselves because we made something out of it. And I don't think it's egocentric to say, sometimes I inspire myself by what I'm able to do, even though I had such a very, very difficult experience in my life. And of course, that's just the biggest, not the only one. So if you look around, it's not that hard to find inspiration. And one of the classic examples is Fred Rogers saying, look for the helpers, right? We look at a bad situation, and often there are perpetrators of the bad situation, or it's just a terrible accident, but there are people that help. When the Cypress structure in the Bay Area where I live went down in an earthquake, what drew my attention was the people who crawled in to get folks out from under the underpass at danger to themselves. You know, that I find that inspiring, that we have that in us as human beings to just feel called to help and to make better. Some things that were coming out at the beginning of the pandemic, John Krasinski did a little show called Some Good News, where he'd talk about inspiring stories. There was an Instagram group called Save with Stories. Just watching healthcare workers, oh my gosh, I can't even believe what healthcare workers have been able to do in this time. And I hope they're finding their own inspiration. So ask yourself for a moment, what has inspired you in this time? What has helped to keep you feeling your humanity and other people's humanity? I do all kinds of strange things sometimes for inspiration. For instance, this morning I read a New York Times wedding article about two men who lost their parents young, who just got married. You know, and they talked about the challenge and finding their way to each other out of that. And I read wedding stories a lot these days because every wedding that's happening right now has happened through challenge, or you know, and obviously New York Times likes there to be even more challenge. Would that have inspired me in the same way before I was able to get married? It might have been a little more mixed, but now I find it inspiring. Another thing that happened for me is I couldn't understand why I was waking up in the morning and watching music videos, but then I realized it was a particular kind. It was encouraging music videos, often that had come about as a result of the pandemic. I love music that comes out of pandemic. Might be somewhat because I'm a musician, I'm a singer, and I sing gospel, which is grief music. So I'm sure that's personal to me. So to notice the ways you find inspiration and go after them as part of your overall program of resilience. So the fourth, and again, not in order, but I do think without the other three, sometimes this goes awry, is to take action. So I mean action in a specific kind of way. It can't be a should, it has to be an action that naturally generates out of your own conception of the difficulty. So for instance, the designer Christian Siriano, pretty immediately when there was a call for masks, converted his entire dressmaking operation to making masks. I think he made thousands and thousands of masks. That was so directly related to what he does in the world, the skills he has, the abilities he has, and the resources he had. He had seamstresses, he had sewing machines, he had masks. I find that if we try to, someone says we need blank, everyone should blank, I find that it's hard to keep it up. It's hard to sustain action like that because it's not coming from deep within us. And I have to say that at certain points, I tried some actions that didn't come so naturally to me, and I had to drop them. They were exhausting me. So actions that come directly out of who we are and what draws us, what we want to do. I'll tell you a little story. I have a client whose daughter died, and we were talking once about when her daughter was sick, what was helpful to her. And she had a friend/acquaintance, they weren't super close, who texted her every week with one line, "I'm thinking about you." Every week, about the same day, every week. That seems like a small thing, but she said it was the most helpful thing that anyone did for her, because it was regular. She felt held in the space of remembrance, and it made a big difference. Well, something tells me that person decided, what action can I take that I can keep doing? And maybe it would appear small, but it wasn't small. It was a small thing that had a big impact. I was doing a lot of talk at the beginning of pandemic about recognizing the efforts, recognizing the actions that seem like non-actions. For instance, staying home. We were staying home to protect ourselves, but we were also staying home to ensure community safety. That's an action. And I think many people were saying to me, I can't do anything. And I was saying, and you are doing something. What you're doing in the service of your own safety and the safety of others works. So I think sometimes actions are quite profoundly subtle, and we have to count them. It doesn't take something big to be something meaningful. So, and also, sometimes actions get thrown out. Here's an example that came to me while I was preparing for this. The Women's March. Did it change anything? I would argue it changed a few things, like the career of the singer Milk, who sung there, but did marching change anything? Maybe yes, maybe no. You have your own opinion, but let's just say it didn't change anything. It changed one thing for sure, the sense of helplessness. The sense of helplessness. And I mean the Women's March right around the inauguration in 2017. Someone said, did I mean suffragettes? That definitely led to change eventually. The suffragettes, it's a good example because that was a long trajectory. So yes, the Me Too movement, all of that, things did change, but did the marchers know they were contributing to that? Even if they didn't, it was an action that fought against helplessness. That matters too. And I love that the comments are letting me know things did change, things did lead to change. True, I totally agree. But the problem is that often people don't know that they will, and they need to do it for their own reasons, just because they feel called to do it. Did I think that going to Stephen Levine workshops would lead me to the work I do in the world would change my life in ways that I'm bringing to you today. No, I went because I was deeply and profoundly upset. And then over time, things led to other things, one step at a time. But I had to follow my own call to action, including crazy actions, like committing to a dying woman, for instance. So it's not always obvious where our actions will go, but taking the ones that call us from deep within us really does make a difference. So that's my 4 points of focus. But I want to add some things in the background to them. I've noticed that if we try to get out of one of those circles by doing another, it doesn't work terribly well. For instance, many people, this would be the most common example, maybe not for this particular group of people, but in general, often people will take action to avoid feeling. And I find that that does not last, that eventually, if it's big enough, Stephen Levine used to say, nothing's new in grief. It's just that it's so big, you can't get out of it. And I agree with that. So it's not that we've never had grief before when the big one comes along. It's that we've been able to get out of it. And by and large, I don't try to get out of it. By and large, where I'm at is where I'm at. And I don't use action to get out of feeling. I also don't use feeling to get out of action. I tend to be a feeling-oriented person. I have to watch out for never taking action because I stay in feeling. Maybe I'm afraid to act. Maybe I know what I need to do, but I don't do it. So I have to watch out in that direction. If you need inspiration, solace won't comfort. You don't need that right then. You need some inspiration. So I think it's true all the way around that keeping an eye on what I'm needing at a given moment is underneath all of this for me. It can be a little tricky sometimes. So especially in a given moment. So I do try to check in about once a week. Have I kind of hit those four areas at some point during the week? Because every day is different. Some days I might just feel bad all day. Other days I'm just hot to trot and do stuff. But I think over the course of the week, I hit them all most weeks. And that helps me to feel that I am taking care of myself in a way that's helpful, that I'm creating some sense of balance, and not because I do try to eat well, I do try to sleep enough, I do try to take walks, but that's kind of just in support of having the energy for these things that take care of me more generally. All right, so just reviewing, and then I think I'd like to ask if we can engage a little bit. We feel what we feel without judgment. We find solace and comfort. We look for inspiration, and we take action. And I just want to share one more little tiny poem and then open it up for all of you. To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. Denise Levertov. Thanks so much for listening. Let's see if there's any questions that I see so far. Not seeing any yet. Anyone have a comment?
So some people were asking Cheryl for this, some of the definitions. Thank you, Deb, for being so great about putting those that information up.
Really?
Then the poem is, I'm going to also send this information out in the follow-up email. The poem is from Denise Levinson. Is that correct?
No, Denise Levertov.
Levertov.
Levertov, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's called?
Hold on. Let me get my notes back
Okay.
up. It doesn't have a title. That's it, the whole poem.
If you send that to me,
No.
then I will include.
And when we get off, I can definitely send it to you. I'll often, I don't know if anyone else has this experience, I'll often have a song that's playing over and over in my head and it doesn't make any sense to me, but if I listen to it, it's telling me something about where I'm at. So poetry, similarly, the things that resonate for me have greater significance if I pay attention to them.
Yes, absolutely.
And the previous poem was David White, in case people don't know that poem, one of my favorites.
Yes, I am going to include that also in the email from with the recording. Let's see. So Mirabelle, here we go. I'm going to drop you down here, Mirabelle, with Cheryl. And if you could go ahead, you're unmuted. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks Cheryl for all your guidance and the strategies. I can understand some of that as a volunteer for grief. Mainly I do my grief support in Spanish, but one of the things that I can also share, and it was from the last words you said about it's just also the practice for self-compassion for us as a providers, as a mom, as a mothers, or as a community, right? Because you mentioned like, what can I do for me right now? And it's often one of the practice that has helped me to not go away from the feeling of despair, of sadness or anger or whatever it is that I'm feeling, but to lean in and to say, what can I do right now for me with this feeling? And it is a practice because sometimes it's not that easy to lean in and to see our own suffering. But what you said, it just reminded me of that.
That reminds me of something I meant to say, that the enemy of everything I'm talking about is self-criticism. And so therefore the salve is self-compassion. And in a previous terrible event that happened during the time of my wife's illness, I was cut off from a child, and my self-hatred just yelled at me for almost 2 years. And I think that our self-hatred is usually kind of muted. What happened at the end of that is it broke. It was like a fever. It broke. And what came out of that was a really increased ability to be compassionate with myself. And to me, what you're talking about is the ability to do that sort of relies on looking at your own experience and caring about it, doesn't it? Because if you're saying, oh, they lost somebody, their grief is bigger than mine. If you're discrediting your own experience, you can't be compassionate. So I really appreciate that you brought in self-compassion, because it's underneath everything I'm talking about, for sure.
Thank you.
We have a question here from Connie, and then Deb has her hand up. So let's go and see. Connie is asking, do you have any thoughts on how to address for people who are having repeat grief from repeated death, like from gun violence, especially seeing the deaths of people in teens or young adulthood? Is there anything that you might offer?
That's such a big subject. That's like 3 more workshops. And yes, I do have some things I want to say about it. I have a colleague who's a woman of color who's doing some work with grief as an as a skill for activism, because of course in communities of color there's a higher rate of loss, and in LGBTQIA communities higher rate, lots of in parts of the town where I live, Oakland, every kid that's in certain schools has had numerous losses. And I think the principles are the same, but the job is harder. How do you show up for yourself and for your community in ways that work? And I have a little bit of a story. I interviewed someone once who was a grief counselor to start with. I can't even remember why she was, because most people don't come to that by accident. But then in the space of a year, 5 people in her family, close family members, died. And they were on death watch, she and her cousin was disappearing every night to do something, but she didn't know what. And she'd come back every night in about an hour. And the person I interviewed, I wish I remembered her name right now. If anyone's curious, reach out and I'll look it up. Anyway, she finally asked her what she was doing. And she said, I'm watching the entire NCIS series, the original one. And she couldn't imagine why she was doing that, but she decided to try it. And so she started going at a different hour to watch. And it was very soothing. And at first she couldn't figure out why, but eventually she figured out that the main character in that has lost his entire family, and he isn't over it, but he's living a life. And I found that just fascinating, that's what was comforting. For me, I suddenly had the weird desire to read mystery novels when I'd never done it before, when my wife was sick. And I didn't know why, but I just did it. I wasn't questioning myself too much at that point. But I realized that it was I've never done it since. I don't read mystery novels now. And I realized that what was happening was that it was giving me a way to grapple with death, because mystery novels always have a death. So sometimes what we do to support ourselves is very mysterious, but I like those mysteries. It does seem to lead somewhere. So that's what I would say. Follow your mysteries within the bounds that there's no harm to yourself or others.
That question, particularly around gun violence and in communities that are so impacted by that kind of loss and gun violence. My cousin worked for many years in the East Oakland schools, and she was taking a class on a field trip. They were 3rd graders, and they had taken the BART, which is the public transportation, to a movie theater. And as they were getting out, this little boy in her class grabbed her hand and just said, "Miss Barber, what's our plan?" And she said, "Well, honey, our plan is that we're going to go see the movie." And he goes, "No, I mean it when they start shooting. What's our plan?" And she just, it was just such a moment for her to realize that no matter how much work she's doing in the community, the lives when they go home at night are so very different. And she said, "You know what? Here's our plan." And she just gave him the biggest hug she could. And she said, "Our plan is that we're going to be together. And we're going to have a good afternoon." And they did that. They were fortunate enough that that's what happened. But she said, in that moment, all she could do was love that boy, and to her best ability. And
I think it's also really crucial, Susan, that we be aware. Here's how I describe it. We're all in the same sea, but then we're not in the same boat.
That's correct.
And to be mindful that we don't all have, for instance, I know people who have who started losing people in their life when they were 6, and it just went on and on and on and on and on and on and on, right? That I will never know that experience from the inside. I can care about it, but I can't pretend I know what that is like, right? And so then for me, if I'm hearing about that experience I haven't had, greater need for empathy, greater need for listening, greater need to open myself up and not come with anything except my presence.
Deb had her hand up. Deb, do you want to put your hand back up? That's the only way I can find you to spotlight you if you would still like to ask a question. I do not see. No, okay. She was having some internet issues earlier, so she may have lost her connectivity for a moment. Any other question? Holly had asked earlier that about when you were speaking, I think about resilience, if it was like assimilation theory. I'm not familiar with assimilation theory in terms of.
I don't know. The title makes me think it might be affiliated, but if I've ever known about it, I'm not recalling it right now. So,
yeah, I think it's really a reference to how we understand, just from looking it up quickly, help us understand how we learn new things and incorporate them into our worldview. It's one of the 2 ways, according to psychologists, that we absorb new knowledge.
Okay, sure, I'll go with that. And maybe we can all think of in our own lives how the biggest learning comes through hard times. I have a 10-year-old grandson. I have 3 grandchildren. He's the oldest. I just got a picture yesterday of him looking very proud with a math paper. And he got an A on the test and he was so excited. But the thing that stood out to me was that his mom in her post said he worked so hard on this. He didn't know how to do it, and then he did it. And that's a simple, that happens from the moment you're born. And people in my line of work, therapy, used to get it so wrong, like everything's formed by 3 and we're just dealing with it. Well, no, we can grow and change our whole lives. I will give a personal example. I was an extremely anxious child and young adult. Social phobic. I was agoraphobic for a time. I really struggled with anxiety. I didn't realize it for a long time, but that's what it was. And in the process of dealing with Joanne's illness, something snapped. I realized I couldn't afford it in a way. And also, the worst thing in the world was happening. I couldn't change it or prevent it. And what else could be scary in the face of that? For the first 2 years, though, I was substantially more anxious. I was terrified. So it took time, but over time, it kind of, I don't consider myself an anxious person anymore. I used to be a very shy person, obviously not so shy anymore. So I think that we can change in relationship to new experience, and that part of the job is inviting the new experience more deeply than just in its outline.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I can take a moment, because I realize you said Cheryl will tell you about her book, and it's kind of relevant. So let me talk about my book for a minute. It is a novel. People think it's my story. It isn't. All the characters are made up, but it very much refers to what we're talking about today. It's called An Ocean Between Them. And it's about a mother and daughter. The mother has estranged from the daughter because she is a lesbian, and the daughter is diagnosed with cancer. And the book is about how they evolve back to each other. The mother more than the daughter, as you might imagine. And to me, that's a very good example. Of course, I've seen that happen, that when something tragic comes along, sometimes people's beliefs and underlying suppositions and biases, sometimes they have to let them go. And I see that happen all the time. That's not a made up thing. That's a thing I've witnessed, that people are in fact capable of transformation and real evolution. It's part of the trouble I have with, I don't know how to get out of it, but sometimes I think we throw people away when they make a mistake. And my bar is, did they learn from it? Did anything different happen afterwards? Did they make use of what they discovered? So that's just a side thing. But if you're interested in the book, it's available anywhere you buy books.
No, I don't see Deb's hand up, so I don't know if she's having trouble. I don't see an audio thing there. So I'm sorry, Deb, that we didn't catch you when you could actually speak.
Me too, because I love conversation. This is the one thing that's really a lot harder for me, presenting on Zoom.
Yeah.
I taught in a continuing education program. I developed in it, taught in it for 3 years, and they were in person. And, you know, what can happen in a room of interaction is obviously different. That's why I wanted to leave a substantial time for interaction, because I just find it so rich. I know what I know, but I don't know everything. That's for sure.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, there was a couple of things that you had talked about, you know, the resilience as being an ability to grow and change, you know, as in this particular way through our losses. And I was having this conversation the other day. I was asked to do a talk for a group of hospice volunteers about compassion and empathy. And of course, loss comes up. And I was just saying, you know, the way I had been sort of trained in the late 1950s and 1960s by my parents to deal with feelings is that you just don't have them. That, you know, if you're crying, I'll give you something to cry about. If, you know, this is just no time for crying, that's not, especially for my 3 brothers, oh my gosh. You know, this just inability to navigate any kind of feeling states, unless it was sort of anger. That was one feeling that my parents were allowed to have. And ours were just very limited. We were just not taught about that. And, you know, I just think that this ability to change and adjust to the losses that we've had, in part for me, was just really learning that there are other emotional states, how to navigate those, and just to sort of learn that territory. It was like learning music or learning a new language. And I think that there's just so many people. I hope that I see in my nieces and nephews a very different sort of a capacity for that. And thank you, Jason. Yeah, I think that, you know, for many, many, many people here, I think in particular, a lot of people who I have found who have become, you know, sort of like, with quotes, the helping profession, you know, are like sort of finding a new way through that and finding a way so that other people don't have to have that very limited range in terms of what you can experience.
I do want to say it isn't like learning an instrument, because you have a choice about learning an instrument. Most people do anyway. My mother didn't give me a choice, but
Not in our family, but anyway.
but it's not the same as these extreme ripping away of things you just don't know how you're going to live without. And someone just asked, did I have anything to say about being present with someone who's dying? I mean, I sure have a lot of practice, as you know, Susan, because also later Susan was one of our caregivers in our caregiving group. So what I would say is that I'm going to speak personally about it because there's no magic pill about it. For me, I couldn't get out of anticipating. I had to be present with the anticipation. Because that's an actual in the moment experience. It's not something that's going to happen. It's something that's happening right then. Grief was nothing like what I imagined it would be like. But in anticipating the loss, I was having a current experience. And here's a simple example. I used to imagine where I was going to put my wife's dresser after she died. I had a persistent, will I put it here? Will I put it there? Will I take all the furniture out of this room and put it in that room? I was like remodeling in my mind. And I'm not really an interior designer at all, but it was mostly the dresser. Where would I put her dresser? And I realized I was grappling with a world in which I would still exist and she wouldn't. And I needed a physical example. And fortunately, by the time that happened, I was kind of out of the guilt phase, where I would think, how can you be thinking about that? Or, why would you want to imagine her dead or anything? I was more curious. Like, why would I be thinking about that? And that was the reason I needed to imagine my world without her. Not because I knew how I would handle it, but because I was afraid of it. It was a current experience of fear. So someone posted anticipatory grief, absolutely. But that doesn't mean make it go away. It means be present with it. And, we did some things that were, I see looking back, almost entirely about my anticipatory grief. I drove her crazy taking videos. We had so many conversations, and I have to tell you, those things really did help. Here's an example. She told me she wanted me to love again. She's like, you are not going to waste this. We learned a hell of a lot. You are not going to waste this. And I was like, so mad. I was so mad when she said that. But the fact that she said it, it could only be said in relationship to a life I would have where she had died, right? You could call that anticipatory grief, but I can't tell you how much that helped me. That one comment freed me so that when I was ready, I was able. So that's an example. It's a real thing. And there are ways to be, if you have a willing other, I think you would say, Susan, that Joanne and I went to the mat on the death thing. Wouldn't you? I mean, we couldn't get out of it, so we went into it. And that really helped me in my grief. You can't be prepared, but you can prepare.
Yes, I mean, being part of that community during that time, I had already experienced the deaths of several, more than 4 or 5 of my dearest friends who died of cancer and AIDS. And then Joanna's death was just, it was so open. Anybody could feel whatever they needed to feel. And the way you manage the 2 kids, I use that example with people talking about how to work with their children. Amber was 2 maybe when Joanne died?
2.5.
Kate was maybe 15?
14.
14.
Mm-hmm.
And just giving them all of the permission they needed every day, that some days they were in the room, some days they didn't want to be in the room, some days they needed to be, she needed to be a teenager and be sort of as recalcitrant as possible. And, other days Amber was just climbing all over the bed. Joanne did say to me at one point, I am done now taking care of people who are here coming to say goodbye to me, but what their expectation is that I'm going to take care of their grief while they're here. They actually have to manage it themselves. And she had that conversation with me and asked me to help manage that. And I was like, oh my God. But those, you know, but that's something that we did work on managing. And that is, I think, very typical when somebody is dying, and doing it in a conscious, sort of awake, available way. That I saw this with several of my friends who were dying, when their friends came to say goodbye or just to visit. And I would see Bob just kind of taking care of them during that visit and helping them like feel like this was better in some way, or that he was going to make it okay for them. And of course he couldn't. People have to manage their own grief. And just seeing those kinds of examples in your family was extraordinarily helpful for all of the times that I've been navigating that since that time.
You know, that just brings up something, Susan, that feels so important to me to talk about for a minute, which is boundaries. We couldn't be there with every single thing that people brought. We were too vulnerable. And I'm thinking of a friend who was coming in sad every day. And believe me, we were not sad every day. In fact, we were pretty joyful, which is weird, but we were. Once you get really present, joy is more available, I guess. Anyway, we sat her down and we said, you know, you're coming in with something. We want you here, but you got to go somewhere else with that. We are not in that space. And if we are on a given day, you'll find out because we'll tell you. But you're coming in assuming something about us that isn't true. So I got braver about saying things directly to people. People in that kind of space can feel it when something's off. Another friend of mine used to bring dinner and it didn't taste right. And then she admitted at one point she hated to cook. She liked to do dishes. Don't bring dinner, come do the dishes, you know, that kind of thing. That sort of folds back around to take the action that's right for you, not just there's an empty slot. Somebody's asking where they can find my radio program. And
I'll put the link up right here while Jason has his hand up here. Let me get out of here and I will bring Jason down here to ask his question. There you go, Jason. Thank you for unmuting.
Hi, Jason.
Hi, Cheryl. Thanks for being here. Thanks for talking to us. So I have my first client as a death doula currently, and she's a great lady, a NICU nurse. She sat vigil with infants going off life support, and she's experienced with some of this, but now she has an impending death in her own family, and she reached out to me. She wants to talk, but she can't, and she's really shut down. And I can recognize that because I was for decades. You know, that was me. So on one hand, I know there's a big difference between wanting to talk and being willing to speak, or just being able, maybe is a better way.
Yeah.
And I know none of this is about me. I just have to be with her in this space. But you're so knowledgeable and experienced. I have to ask, do you have any thoughts on that or advice? I mean, there's nothing I can do to kind of charm her out of that, but.
I had a client one time who just popped to my head, and she just had a hard time. She was under no duress directly. It was historical, but she had a hard time speaking. And I think that can come from trauma. You know, sometimes you just can't bring the words, like a lot of people who've survived war, who've been in battle. It's not that they wouldn't want to talk about it, they can't, right? So what worked with this person over time was me constantly reinforcing the value of silence. We don't need to talk, we can just sit together. And it was a long time before this person that I'm thinking of could get comfortable with that. But your client is specifically coming to sit with you, and she's not ready to speak. So she's not just there to speak. She's there to be accepted where she's at.
I should clarify, this is long distance. I'm in New Mexico and she's in Salt Lake. And that's why I'm really struggling, is I can sit in a room with I know what it's like to suffer, and I know what it's like to be alone. I have an autoimmune disease. I have chronic pain. So I can, so much of this work makes sense to me. But to do this over text, to not be able to read the tone of her voice, to not be able to see her expressions, it's hard. So
He doesn't want to Zoom, I take it.
I guess not. I've presented, and I'll keep reminding her occasionally, gently, of, we can have a conversation sometime. If you don't want to do it on Zoom, we can do it on the phone. I told her I write letters, whatever
Jason,
way she wants to do it.
here's what's coming to my mind, and I'm pretty sure any question relates to more than you, right? Investigate your own helplessness.
Sure.
I can't think of anything else to do there, right? And do something. Remember when I said that person who just said, I'm thinking about you at a regular interval was the most important thing that person received? That's what comes to my mind with what you're talking about. And you could acknowledge the difficulty. Just, I know that you're not in a space where you can easily talk about this yet. I'm just gonna, I'll be here. I don't know what else you could do, right?
Yeah, I love that you say that, because I thought of her in that moment as you were talking, and that's really what it's been. Is I just check in with her. She got COVID the other day, and she's grateful to have COVID so that she has some time off. She doesn't have to be in the hospital. That's like, she's really struggling. So
The level of compassion, fatigue, and grief that healthcare workers are experiencing, and not just the ones who are directly dealing with COVID, because the whole system is so maxed out. It's going to be a long time people are dealing with what's happened in this time, and hopefully, going forward, I always see that potential, but it's a lot. It's really a lot.
thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jason. Eileen, you have yourself unmuted. I don't know if that's because you wanted to ask a question or if you're just unmuted, but if you'd like to ask a question without being spotlighted here, you can just go ahead and do that. I can't really find you here without the hand raising part. So would you like to? Okay, she's just muted again. Well, it's perfect timing because it looks like we are at the end of our time together. And Cheryl, I can't thank you enough. I mean, it's just, I was thinking about this as you were talking, that the reason that we know each other, the reason that this event is actually happening is because of the incredible loss that we've both experienced, and that opened doors for us. And for myself, I'll speak for myself, that probably nothing could, and that ripping away of all of the defenses that had been built up over a lifetime. Was 30 when this happened. So as I joke with people, I tell them I was not on this line at career day in high school. And one of my high school friends is actually here in the room, I think. And I just imagine us standing in our high school guidance counselors, like being on the death and dying line for work. That just didn't happen. So it's just so beautiful that so many people use these opportunities that are extraordinarily painful to open doors for lives that they did not expect to be living. Do you want to say something? I'm going to just give a couple of just a little information about events, and I will tell everybody I'm going to stay on. I don't know that Cheryl has that opportunity. I'll stay on for a couple of minutes if people want to stay on after we stop recording. But I do want to say that on behalf of the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation, we're incredibly grateful you spent your time with us, Cheryl, that all of you who were, all of you that you took the time to be here this morning. The recording will go out. And one of the things you mentioned early on about Stephen, reminding us to not reject things. There's a beautiful book, Frank Ostaszewski has written a beautiful book called The 5 Invitations. And the first invitation is welcome everything, turn nothing away. And I'm saying that because starting on February 16th, one of our facilitators, Rye Halpern, who facilitates our monthly Deaf Cafe, is going to be doing a 5-part deep dive into that book, The 5 Invitations. And I will put that information also in the email to follow up. It's a wonderful book to read, and it's a wonderful way to be together, kind of assimilating new approaches and tools that you can use anywhere in your life. So thank you for that. And just really, thank you so much, Cheryl. It's been quite the ride these last 30 years.
Yeah, may it be many more.
And so for all of you, I wish that wishes for all of us to be at peace and to be free of suffering. I also think it would be so wonderful to just start introducing ourselves to new people we meet by just not giving them the whole rundown of what it is we do and where, our sort of social strata lands, but just asking, what losses are you navigating right now? Because the conversations we would be having with each other would be so incredibly rich indeed. So yes, maybe we'll do a website or we'll do something about that, Cheryl. But anyway, thank you all. I am going to turn off the recording. We look forward to seeing you either on February 16th or at the end of this month. There's a beautiful offering by Pam McPherson called Vigil, the Poetry of Presence. She's been a hospice worker for over 30 years and does a lot of vigils, lots of vigils with people who are dying so they don't die alone, and has written a gorgeous book. That's going to be on the 16th at 6 p.m. our time in the Pacific area. So thank you so much. And I'm going to be turning off the recording.